Episode 5. Outpost. The transfer vehicle docked at 6:14 a.m. Station time, and Renn waited while the pressure equalized. The wait was 3 minutes. She counted them. The port arm trembled faintly when the seal engaged, a vibration that moved up through the floor and into the soles of her boots, and she filed it. The installation flexed when it accepted a vehicle. Not unusual for rock construction. She had felt the same thing at FSA and at other facilities. She filed it anyway. The airlock cycled. The door opened into corridor A1. The first thing she noticed was the air. She had been breathing recycled atmosphere for 6 days on the transfer vehicle, and she had expected AB7 to feel like a change. It didn't. Not in the direction she'd expected. It was thicker with processing byproduct than the vehicle's mix, a metallic undertone that sat at the back of the throat, sharp and chemical, specific enough that she identified it immediately as water reclamation output cycling through ventilation that couldn't fully clean it. She knew she would stop noticing it within 24 hours and knew she would notice it again as an absence when she left, the way it always worked. The temperature was 18 degrees Celsius, 1 degree cooler than FSA. The corridor was roughly 4 meters wide. The ceiling was 1 meters, estimated by measuring it against her own height, and confirmed this later on the facility schematic. The ceiling at FSA had been 4 meters. That difference had been abstract on paper. Here it was her shoulders rolling slightly inward without instruction, her posture adjusting to something it hadn't been told to adjust to. The magnetic boots were standard ICD issue, same as FSA, same as everything above the moon. They produced a soft rhythmic clank on the metal grating floor. The sound carried in the narrow corridor. Her footsteps preceded her like an announcement, sharp and regular, echoing faintly off the rock that was somewhere above the metal and composite of the ceiling. 40 meters or 200 meters depending on location, dark and airless, and rotating slowly around its own center at a pace so gradual it registered not as movement but as permanence. A man was waiting at the far end of a one. He stood with his back mostly to the junction, reading from a tablet, and looked up when he heard her coming. He was somewhere in his late 40s, broad through the shoulders, a face that had the particular erosion of someone who had spent a long time in recycled air and fluorescent light. Not unhealthy, compressed, the years here having packed themselves in more densely than years somewhere else would have. "Commander Renn," he said, not a question. He'd known exactly when her vehicle was docking. "Station Director Akafer, welcome to AB7. He said it the way a person reads a line they've read too many times. He offered his hand and she shook it. "I'll take you to your quarters," he said. "Then we can go over the schedule." She followed him. The junction opened into corridor A2, which ran the main spine of the installation. She counted the branching corridors as they passed: B1, B2, B3 to port, C1, C2 to starboard. The schematic had been in her briefing packet and she had memorized it on the vehicle, but there is a difference between memorizing a diagram and walking the geometry. B2 was shorter than it looked on the schematic. C1 ran at a slight downward incline she hadn't expected, maybe 4 degrees of grade, nothing you'd call a slope, but enough to register in the thighs after a few passes. The facility was built into the rock in sections added over 15 years, and you could feel where one section ended and another began. Subtle differences in ceiling height, floor quality, the sound the boots made on different grades of grading. The newer sections produced a slightly higher tone. The original sections were deeper and more resonant. "The crew knows why you're here," Akafer said. "That's expected. Some of them are nervous. That's expected too." He glanced back at her. She kept her face neutral. He turned forward again. 2 deaths in 2 months, he said. "I read the reports. The first was a cardiac event, 41 years old. We medevaced him on the next supply transfer, but he didn't make it past Echo 7. A pause. The second was Malone. I'll want to see Section 7C when I'm ready." He didn't push for timeline. She noted that. Her quarters were in Section D, the accommodation block, and they were smaller than the equivalent space at FSA. The bunk folded down from the wall. The desk was a bolted surface with a lip to prevent objects from drifting in the event of a boot malfunction. The terminal was standard ICD issue, 2 years older than the FSA model. She set her bag on the bunk and unzipped it and removed her materials in order: case files, recording equipment, 2 changes of clothing, her toiletry case, and the folded jacket she didn't need here because AB7 ran warmer than the transfer vehicles, but that she kept with her regardless. She hung it on the hook inside the locker door. The photograph was in the inside pocket. She didn't check it. She left the jacket on the hook and turned to the terminal. Interviews start at 9:00 a.m. She told Akaffer, who was still in the doorway. I'll arrange it. Full access to the maintenance logs for Outer Tunnel Section 7C. Not the summary, the complete record. I'll also need the relay transmission records from the last 14 months, packet-level detail. The maintenance records I can authorize immediately. The relay records will need routing through clearance. Start it now. I'd like access before I sleep tonight. He took out his tablet and began. The maintenance access code came through on her terminal before he'd left the doorway. The relay authorization would arrive within 2 hours, he said. He left. She heard his boots on the grating, uneven on D corridor's grade, fading. She sat down and opened the maintenance logs. Outer Tunnel Section 7C was a geological survey corridor bored into the asteroid's rock during the second construction phase, 11 years ago, to access a mineral deposit that turned out to be economically marginal. It had been repurposed as storage 4 years back when a supply delivery arrived, and the primary warehouse was full. The storage assignment was a practical decision someone had made quickly and logged briefly, and nobody had revisited. Backup solar array components, hull sealant stock, a reserve water reclamation module still in its original shipping casing. The official record of the decompression event was 14 lines. Petra Malone, GSD-3, Geological Survey Technician, 3rd year of her AB7 posting. Maintenance fault in the outer seal of Section 7C. The seal had shown intermittent pressure warnings over a 12-day period before the event. Work order logged. Repairs pending. Malone had been conducting an inventory of the stored equipment when the seal failed. The event was recorded at 11:23 p.m. station time on the 17th. 2 crew members had responded to the emergency alert within 4 minutes. The corridor had already repressurized via emergency bulkhead by then. What they found in that corridor was not described with particularity. The record said, remains consistent with catastrophic decompression. The record said, recovered for protocol disposition. Renn read those 2 phrases. Then she read the section on the seal's 12-day maintenance window 3 times. The work order had been logged by a systems technician on day 2 of the warning period. The work order had been closed on day 9, 3 days before the event, with a notation that the seal had been inspected and rated serviceable. The technician who had logged and closed the work order was listed by crew number. She cross-referenced the crew number in the personnel manifest. The number belonged to a crew member named Darrow Finch. She wrote his name on the physical notepad she kept for this purpose and set it face down on the desk. Then she waited for the relay authorization and spent the time reading through 3 years of Malone's performance reviews and geological survey reports. The reports were technical and specific and showed a working pattern, careful documentation, methodical coverage of assigned survey zones, occasional notes on geological features outside the strict scope of her assignment but recorded with the incidental precision of genuine interest. The reviews were consistent and unremarkable, competent, self-directed, no flags. The relay authorization arrived at 11:47 p.m. The relay records were dense, 14 months of outgoing telemetry, incoming supply manifests, standard operational reports. She was not looking for the content of the transmissions. She was looking for the transmission architecture, the data volume logs, the packet-level records that showed size and routing information for every transmission regardless of whether its content was classified above her clearance. She found the anomaly at 3:17 a.m. For the last 8 months of Petra Malone's life, a small secondary data packet had been embedded in the regular telemetry stream at intervals between 4 and 11 days. The packets were compressed and small, calibrated to the noise floor of the geological survey equipment's standard transmission signal. Malone had used the survey equipment's own authorized protocols as a carrier and had embedded the secondary packets below the threshold of automated monitoring. The intervals were irregular, a security choice, since regular intervals were the easiest thing for automated review to catch. The variable spacing was considered, not random. She had thought about this carefully before acting on it. Renn sat back for a moment. She looked at the ceiling of the quarters, which was plain composite too, 1 meter above her, 31 years old, 3 years and 4 months at AB7. In this space every day, in recycled air and fluorescent light, looking at the landscape photographs in the mess hall at every meal, building something careful and considered in the telemetry signal, building it over 8 months, thinking it was going somewhere. She turned back to the terminal. For the first 2 months, the packets had left AB7 intact. For the last 6 months, they hadn't. She found the interception layer at 4:02 a.m. It was clean work. The relay node at ICD station Echo 7, the nearest routing infrastructure between AB7 and the inner system, had been configured to intercept, copy, and empty Malone's secondary packets before forwarding them. The forwarded packets were intact in size and in their header information. Their content had been replaced with null data. 6 months of transmissions. Whoever Malone had believed she was reaching, whoever she had been trying to get something to, had received nothing but correctly sized empty files for half a year. The files would have arrived looking normal at the routing level. They would have been indistinguishable from real transmissions unless the recipient opened them and found nothing. Renn sat with that for a moment. The chair had a slight give to it that FSA's hadn't. The structural vibration was in the floor, coming up through the soles of the boots even while seated, the slow rotation of the asteroid expressing itself through metal and bolt and grating. The air was 18 degrees. The metallic undertone she'd arrived smelling sharply had softened to something she now only noticed when she thought about it. The overhead light buzzed at a frequency just at the edge of perceptible, a sound that would be inaudible in a louder environment. And here was simply part of the room, the way everything present in a sealed space eventually became part of the room. Malone had spent 6 months hiding transmissions that contained nothing. She had been careful and skilled, and certain she was doing something, and she had been working in a vacuum she couldn't see. She had built something with real operational thought and real commitment, and the ICD had been inside it for 6 of those 8 months, reading everything she sent before it left the relay node, emptying the packets and forwarding the correctly sized shells so that whatever she believed she was reaching received empty vessels on schedule, every time, and had no reason to suspect anything. The ICD intercepted things. That was part of what the ICD did and had always done. The specific cruelty was in the forwarding, in the decision to send the empty shells through rather than simply block them, to let Malone watch her transmission logs show normal outgoing data, to let her believe for 6 months that whatever she was building was being built. She had died not knowing. She had been careful and committed, and she had spent the last half year of her life constructing something that already wasn't there. She had gone into outer tunnel section 7C on the night of the 17th, and the seal had failed, and she had died, and she had never known. Whatever she had thought she was building, whatever she had believed was important enough to hide in the telemetry stream for 8 months. All of it had been taken apart at the relay level while she kept building it. Renn turned the notepad over and wrote a second line below Finch's name. She flipped it face down again and went to sleep. She was up at 7:00 a.m. She ate in the crew mess, second shift, and the table gave her the careful silence of 40 people who had been aware of her presence since she docked and were managing that awareness with various degrees of success. She ate and watched. The mess was the largest single space in AB7, which wasn't saying much. It held 12 at capacity and was configured around 2 bolted tables and a serving counter along the starboard wall. Someone had attached 4 photographs to the wall above the counter: a mountain range, a coastline, a field of something yellow in bloom, a river in forest. She looked at them while she ate. They were the kind of photographs that appeared in every enclosed installation she had worked in. Always the same subjects, landscapes that were specifically not enclosed, specifically not sealed, specifically not underground or undersurface or inside anything. The ICD hadn't removed them during the last administrative review. She had noticed this in the briefing materials without noting it, and now she was noting it. 40 people looking at an open field and an open coastline every day for months and years, and the program had decided that was acceptable. That was the kind of calculation the program made. She finished her meal. Section D corridor outside her quarters ran roughly east-west on the facility schematic. She had been hearing a specific gait pattern in that corridor since she arrived. A crew member with a left foot that landed harder than the right, a slightly longer pause between strides than most people had. She'd clocked it at least 8 times in 2 days and still hadn't matched it to a face. She let it stay unresolved. Some things were not the things she was here for. After breakfast, she spent an hour in the facility's main records room, which was a terminal alcove off corridor B1 that held 2 workstations and a wall of physical binders that hadn't been touched since they'd been filed. The binders were section maintenance records from the original construction phase, the kind of documentation that existed because someone had been required to produce it, and that nobody had looked at since. She pulled the binders for Section C and Section B and the outer tunnel sections, and worked through the technical specifications for the outer seal models installed in Phase 2 construction. The seal model was an older design. Its retention clip system had been flagged in an ICD engineering review 8 years ago as acceptable but maintenance-intensive, specifically requiring locking rather than pressing of the secondary clips during inspection. The flag was in the binder. The flag had not been transcribed into the active maintenance protocols for those sections. The active maintenance protocols were what inspecting technicians used. She photographed the relevant pages from the binder and logged them in her case file. At 9:00 a.m., she began the interviews. She interviewed 11 crew members before lunch in the Section B2 briefing room. The room barely held the table and 4 chairs, and the equipment cabinet bolted to the starboard wall. The ventilation intake was partially blocked by the cabinet, and the metallic undertone of the air was stronger here than in the corridors, concentrated in a space that didn't fully turn over. She noticed this in the first 30 seconds. She ran the recorder on the table surface and said nothing about either thing. Geological survey, maintenance, operations, 1 medical officer. She asked each of them about Petra Malone. She asked about Section 7C. She asked about the SEAL's 12-day warning period and who had worked on it and who had been in or near that corridor in the 2 weeks before the 17th. She watched hands and she watched where eyes went when a question arrived they hadn't fully prepared for. She kept her face at a consistent neutral throughout, not cold, not warm, not pressing. Between the first and second interviews, she stepped out into B2 corridor for 4 minutes. The corridor was empty. The grating under her boots had the slightly higher tone of the newer construction section, and the temperature was the same as everywhere else in AB7, but felt different in an unoccupied space. The air circulation pattern different. The way the ventilation moved more freely without bodies in the way. She stood there and listened to the installation's specific register of quiet, the recycling system cycling at its low constant frequency, the structural vibration moving up through the floor, the faint sound of someone in a distant section running something mechanical. No windows anywhere in the installation. No reference point for time beyond the station clock. You could stand in any corridor at any hour, and the environment was identical. The same recycled light and the same recycled air and the same sealed ceiling and the same grating underfoot. The crew had been living inside this sameness for months and years. She went back in for the second interview. 4 of the 11 mentioned Darrow Finch without being prompted, not as a suspect, as a presence. He was the kind of person who gets mentioned because he is always there, always visible. The specific product a 40-person installation makes when it keeps the same crew in a small space long enough, and one of them has been there the longest. He knew the systems. He knew the rock. The 2 crew members who had been at AB7 longest, 5 years each, talked about him with the mixture of respect and unease you develop for someone who has adjusted to a place more completely than you have, and whose adjustments are not entirely legible. He'd been here since AB7 had 26 personnel, before the 3rd construction phase, before the power distribution upgrade 6 years ago that he had designed and implemented largely alone when the original system started failing, and no one from Earth had come to help. The installation remembered him the way old buildings remember the people who helped build them. One of the geological survey technicians, a woman named Adamu, had worked in the adjacent survey corridor to 7C for 2 years of her posting and had been reassigned to interior survey after an equipment malfunction in her section. She had no connection to Malone that she described, but she talked about working in the outer tunnel sections with a specificity that made Renn pause. Adamu described the outer seals as the thing you learn to watch, as the oldest components in those corridors, as the parts that were original to Phase 2 construction, and that nobody had ever fully upgraded because replacing them would have required taking the sections offline for weeks, and the ICD hadn't wanted to spend the operational time. Everyone who worked the outer sections knew that the seals were the thing. You checked them. You checked them even when they weren't showing warnings. You developed a relationship with them, the way you develop a relationship with anything that is the difference between the air you're breathing and the absence of air. Renn asked her how long she'd been at AB7. For years, Adamu said, and she looked at Renn with the quality of someone who understood exactly what question came after that one. Renn didn't ask the question that came after that one. She thanked her and noted the time and sent her back to her section. After the interview, she went to Section 7C. The emergency bulkhead was engaged at the B3 corridor entrance, sealed and logged. The access panel beside it showed the current status of the outer seal, condemned. The panel displayed the work order history, including maintenance photographs appended to the Day 9 inspection log. 6 photographs. She examined each one. The first 3 showed the seal assembly in wide view, mid-view, and close-up of the compression surface and locking collar. Nothing in those 3 photographs was out of place. The compression surface showed wear consistent with 2 years of use, not aggressive, and the surface integrity looked serviceable. The 4th photograph showed the secondary retention clip on the upper port quadrant of the seal assembly. The clip was seated. The clip appeared correctly positioned, but the edge of the clip's housing showed a shadow. It could have been an artifact of the photograph's angle, the light source slightly off, the camera sensor picking up a gradient that wasn't there. She looked at it for a long time. She moved her head so the light from the access panel hit the screen differently. The shadow didn't change. A correctly locked retention clip produced a different housing profile than a pressed clip. Pressing a clip placed it visually in position. Locking it required rotating the housing a quarter turn and engaging the internal catch. The visual difference was subtle in ideal lighting and almost invisible in the maintenance-grade illumination of a narrow sealed corridor. The functional difference was the difference between a seal that held and one that failed under the pressure cycling that happened every time. A magnetic boot vibrated the floor in that section. Every time the temperature fluctuated during the asteroid's slow shadow and sun rotation. Every time the structural movement of the rock transmitted through the composite and into the seal housing and into the retention clip that was seated but not locked. She photographed the panel screen and walked back up the corridor. Darrow Finch was working in the power distribution room in Section C2 when she found him, at an open panel in the wall, running a diagnostic on the secondary relay board. He heard her coming from 20 meters and he knew who it was before he turned around. Commander Renn, Mr. Finch. He closed the panel without hurrying. He was 38 years old and he looked older, skin under the eyes compressed and gray, face lean, posture carrying the subtle adjustment to low ceilings that everyone here developed. A slight forward set in the neck and shoulders that had probably stopped feeling like anything years ago. His hands were clean, and his forearms carried the faded marks of years of work in tight spaces. Minor burns and abrasions healed to near invisibility. "I'm not on your schedule until 3:00 p.m., he said. "I wanted to see where you worked." He looked at the panel and then at her. The room was about 3 meters wide and 5 meters long. 2 overhead lights, one working, one producing a faint clicking on a 30-second cycle. The floor grating here had the deeper, more resonant tone of the original construction sections. The structural vibration was stronger in this part of the installation than anywhere else she'd been. He had been living with it for 7 years. She wondered if he felt it in his feet on Earth, on leave, in the first days back in gravity before the body remembered what normal was. He gestured toward the bench along the opposite wall, I don't have another chair. I'll stand. She stood in the center of the room. He leaned against the bench with his arms crossed, not aggressive, patient, like someone who had prepared for this conversation and had decided that patience was the correct posture for it. Petra Malone, she said. He uncrossed his arms and put his hands flat on the bench on either side of him. He did it without seeming to notice he was doing it. The hands were still. I've been expecting this conversation, he said. How long? Since you docked. She watched him. His hands were flat, his breathing regular, his face holding the specific quality of a person who has worked out in advance what this is going to be and has positioned himself accordingly. Walk me through the work order, she said. Section 7C seal. You logged it on day 2 of the warning period. That's right. You were the responding technician. I was on-call systems rotation that week. The pressure sensor alert came through the rotation log. I logged the work order and tagged it for scheduled maintenance. You closed it on day 9, rated serviceable. That's in the record. The 4th photograph in the inspection log, upper port quadrant, the secondary retention clip. He was quiet for 4 seconds. His jaw moved faintly, not a clench, something more controlled than a clench. An impulse converted before it completed. I inspected the seal assembly. I made a judgment on the clip based on what I observed. I rated it serviceable and logged it. Was it serviceable? The rating was serviceable, that's what I logged. She let that sit. The light clicked at its interval, the floor vibrated. You knew Petra Malone, she said. She was crew. 40 people on this installation, you know everyone. How well did you know her? Well enough to recognize her at meals. Well enough to nod when we passed in the corridor. She was good at her work. He paused. I didn't know her personally. Did you know she was transmitting? His jaw moved again. I don't know the content of what she was transmitting. That's not what I asked. He looked at her directly. His eyes were brown and steady. I knew she was sending something she wasn't cleared to send. How did you know? I run power distribution for this installation. I track everything that draws on the system. The geological survey equipment has a standard power profile during the scheduled telemetry window. Malone's equipment was running past the scheduled window at a lower draw than standard on a cycle that didn't match the telemetry schedule or anything else on my load inventory. When did you first notice it? About 7 months ago. And you didn't report it? No. Why not? He looked at her directly. His eyes didn't change. Because the report would have gone to ACAFR. ACAFR reports to Clearance Division, and Clearance Division's response time for personnel security issues at an installation at this distance is between 3 and 7 weeks in my experience. People who've been transmitting unauthorized data have a way of continuing to transmit while clearance decides what to do about them. The decision takes longer than the breach, so you handled it yourself. I handled a security breach. She kept her face level, the light clicked, the vibration was constant in the floor. Did you know what she thought she was transmitting, she said. He was quiet for a moment that was different from the rest, less prepared, not absent but turned inward, the question requiring him to check something. No. Were you curious? Another silence, shorter. No. The 2 silences had been different from each other. She filed both of them without comment. Walk me through the night of the 17th, she said. He did. Routine maintenance check of corridor C2 from 10:00 p.m. to 11:45 p.m. 3 crew members could confirm his presence at various points in that window. He had logged into the C2 maintenance terminal at 10:07 p.m. and logged out at 11:38 p.m. The log was on record. The crew confirmations were on record. He had been nowhere near Section 7C. She let him finish. The last time you were personally in Section 7C, she said. Day 7 of the warning period. 2 days before your Day 9 inspection. Correct. What were you doing there on Day 7? Visual check on the sealant stock. Supply delivery was scheduled 2 weeks out and I wanted current inventory numbers before it arrived. And you observed the seal at that point. I noted the warning had been running for 7 days and was still below action threshold. I continued my inventory check. You didn't note anything further about the physical condition of the seal. I noted it was below action threshold. That's what I logged. She wrote something on her pad. He watched her hand. She set the pad face down. In 7 years at this installation, she said, have you ever filed a report that turned out to be inaccurate? 2 seconds. Not to my knowledge. Have you ever taken an action in the interest of the program that you didn't formally document? 4 seconds. Yes. Give me an example. When I first arrived, the power distribution system had an undocumented configuration a previous technician had set up, more efficient than the standard manual spec for our specific load profile. I continued running it rather than resetting to standard and filing an exception. It ran better. I documented it 8 months later when the formal process caught up. Why not document it immediately? Because the documentation process for a configuration change at this installation requires clearance review. Clearance review would have taken longer than the operational benefit justified. His voice was the same throughout, flat and measured, with the specific quality of someone who has said something in their own head so many times that saying it aloud has become a kind of reading. The installation ran better. I made a judgment call. Operational benefit versus process cost. He held her gaze. Something in his expression shifted slightly, not enough to name. The program is too distributed to run on process alone. Everyone who's been in it long enough understands that. Petra Malone was applying her own judgment, Renn said. He looked at his hands flat on the bench between them. He looked back up. His face was the same as it always was, close to nothing. She was transmitting unauthorized data from an ICD installation. The program has always treated that as a security breach. The geography doesn't change what it is. Did the geography affect your response? I was here. I could handle it here. That's the geography. She looked at him for a moment. He held the look. I'll see you at 3:00 p.m., she said, formal interview on the record. He picked up the diagnostic tool from the bench beside him. Is there something specific you want me to prepare? Just be there. She walked back up C2. Behind her, she heard him put the tool down and open the panel again. The 3:00 p.m. interview ran 90 minutes. She ran him through everything she had asked informally, in the same order, and asked additional questions. The specific equipment stored in Section 7C, and who else had authorization to access it. The 2 crew members who had responded to the emergency alert, and what they had found, and what condition the corridor had been in. Malone's working schedule in the weeks before the 17th, whether he had observed any change in her behavior or movement patterns or working hours in that period. His answers were precise and consistent with his earlier answers where they overlapped. Nothing offered that hadn't already been offered. The preparation was thorough and the execution was disciplined. Technically accurate, strategically complete. She asked him whether he had made undocumented operational decisions. He described the power distribution configuration in the same words, the same sequence, the same framing as before. She let him finish. Is there anything else, she said. He held her gaze. There's always something else. In 7 years at an installation like this, you make judgment calls every week that aren't in any formal record. You make them because the program requires it. You make them because the alternative is waiting for clearance and the installation doesn't wait. What's the line for you, she said, in a judgment call and something that crosses it. He thought about that, not the way he thought about questions he prepared for. This was the way he thought about a question that had actually surprised him. The program's integrity, he said finally. That's the line. A judgment call protects the program. Crossing the line damages it. Who decides which is which? The person who's here, he said, when no one else is. She wrote something on her pad. She said it face down. Malone was here too, she said. He didn't say anything. She made a judgment call. She decided something was important enough to transmit. She decided the program needed to have whatever she was sending, even if the program didn't know it needed it yet. Renn looked at him. She was applying the same framework you just described. She was transmitting data she had no authorization to transmit. You had no authorization to close that work order with a pressed clip. The room held that for a moment. The briefing room's ventilation moved imperfectly around them. The structural vibration was in the floor the way it was everywhere in this installation. I protected the installation, he said. His voice was the same as before, the same measured register, but something underneath it had shifted slightly, a quality she hadn't heard in the power distribution room, something between certainty and its maintenance, certainty being held in position rather than simply occupying a position. I protected the program. That's what I've been doing for 7 years. That's the work. Malone thought she was protecting something too, Renn said. She thought whatever she was transmitting needed to get out. She was wrong. How do you know? Because people who transmit unauthorized data from ICD installations are always wrong. That's what it means to be in the program. You work inside it or you don't work. She looked at him. He held her gaze with the same steadiness he had maintained throughout, and she believed him. Not that what he said was true, but that he believed it. That the 7 years and the work and the decisions and the things he had done here had produced a person who could look at what had happened to Petra Malone and locate it entirely within the framework of protecting the program and feel no friction from that location. That was the thing about AB7 and what it did. Not that it made people into monsters. It made people into a specific configuration of certainty. It took the distance from Earth and the isolation and the operational autonomy and the years of making calls with no oversight except your own judgment, and it built something you couldn't necessarily see from inside. She wrote something on her pad. She said it face down. "Is there anything you want to tell me that isn't already in the record?" she said. The question landed clean and she let it sit. He held her gaze for 6 seconds. "No," he said. "There isn't." She closed the recorder. She filed her preliminary report at 7:00 p.m. She listed the cause of the decompression event as equipment malfunction, seal failure consistent with the documented maintenance history, no evidence of deliberate interference. She described the warning period, the work order closure, and rated the maintenance decision as within standard operational discretion for an installation of AB7 resource tier. The language was the language the ICD used for outcomes it needed confirmed. She wrote it the way you write something you've written before. Then she sat at the terminal for 4 minutes. The air was 18 degrees. The overhead buzz was at its consistent frequency. Somewhere down section D, the crew member with the heavy left foot was moving again through the corridor, the same gait she'd been hearing for 2 days. The photograph was in the jacket on the locker hook. She opened a secondary file and wrote what she actually had. The retention clip's shadow in the 4th photograph. Finch's presence in Section 7C on day 7, 2 days before his inspection. The specific technical knowledge required to understand the difference between a pressed clip and a locked clip. The engineering flag in the Phase 2 construction binder, the flag that had never been transcribed into active maintenance protocols. His alibi for the 17th. Solid, documented, consistent, the kind that gets built before the night in question. Malone's transmission history. The interception layer at Echo 7. 8 months of embedded packets, 6 months emptied at the relay, Malone never knowing. And the thing that wasn't in any document, the quality of his pause when she'd asked whether he'd been curious. The way that particular silence had been different from all his other silences, the silences he'd prepared and the silence he hadn't. She marked the file at the highest classification she carried. She added the secondary lock and encrypted the session. The file was not a report. It was a record. The ICD would not see it unless she submitted it. She locked the session and went to dinner. The mess at AB7 held 12 people at capacity, and she was in the 2nd shift, at a table with operations crew and 2 geological survey technicians still on active status. The meal was edible in the technical sense. The conversation moved around her with the carefulness of people performing normalcy slightly harder than it comes naturally. She ate and watched and didn't participate in the conversation beyond the minimum. She noticed one of the operations crew watching her from across the table, not hostile, not trying to catch her eye. Just watching the way people watched her when they wanted to know what she'd found and knew better than to ask. She had seen this in every installation. The people who had nothing to hide were often the most anxious. The mechanism was simple. When someone came to investigate, the people with clean records knew their records were clean, and they also knew that clean records were not the only way an investigation resolved. They had watched Malone die and Finch get sick, and they were calculating what that meant for them, for their own numbers, for their continued presence in the program. Renn ate her meal. Finch was at the 3rd shift table, visible through the mess door when it opened. She saw him twice in 40 seconds. Both times he was looking at his food. After the meal, she reviewed Petra Malone's personnel file in full. 31 years old, born in Abbotsford, British Columbia. Geology degree from Simon Fraser University, 2016. ICD Recruitment 2018. First posting, Surface Survey on Mars, 18 months. Second posting, AB7, 3 years and 4 months at the time of her death. Performance reviews consistent and unremarkable. Competent, self-directed, no flags. One commendation from her Mars posting for identifying a mineral deposit the ICD's Resource Assessment Office had missed, cited in the quarterly report that year. The file had a photograph. She was dark-haired and wore an expression that was not quite a smile, facing the camera with a composure that said she had somewhere else to be. Renn looked at the photograph for a moment. Malone had been 31 years old. She had been here for 3 years and 4 months, and she had been good at her work, and she had decided something needed to be transmitted, and she had spent 8 months carefully transmitting it. And for the last 6 months of her life, what she was transmitting had been nothing. And then she had gone into Outer Tunnel Section 7C on the night of the 17th, and she had been 31 years old in a sealed corridor with a failed outer seal, and that had been the end of her. She closed the photograph. She continued reading. The personal effects inventory, clothing, toiletry case, 2 physical books. She noted the titles. A music player with an ambient electronic catalog. A tablet with personal photographs and correspondence, sealed per protocol. 1 small case of personal items. A locket, 2 letters in plain envelopes, and a data chip. The data chip had been scanned in the inventory and returned to the effects case per the ICD's protocol for personal data not related to operational matters. Renn pulled the effects case from storage at 9:40 p.m. She signed for it at the night duty station and took it to her quarters and set it on the desk under the work light. The locket was plain silver, oval, open, empty. The letters were in plain envelopes with no return addresses, and she did not open them. The data chip was smaller than she'd expected, about the size of her thumbnail, standard ICD storage format. She plugged it into her terminal. The reader ran the chip for 40 seconds, long enough to indicate damaged or complicated file architecture. It produced one result. 1 file, unnamed, file type unrecognized. Corruption flags across the entirety of its data structure. She ran the standard recovery utility. 38 seconds. Nothing. She ran a second utility, one she'd been given at a training session the ICD hadn't offered to everyone, a tool for finding coherent data within corrupted files by identifying intact bit sequences below the standard recovery floor. That utility ran for 2 minutes and 12 seconds. It produced a single fragment, 14 words, plain text, no formatting, no metadata, no indication of where in the file's original structure it had come from. Before the signal, there was a voice, and IT knew our name. She read it once. She read it again. Renn sat in the chair with 18-degree air and the metallic undertone and the structural vibration in the soles of her feet, and she held those 14 words in her mind and turned them against everything she knew. They didn't match any ICD catalog designation. They weren't a coordinate string or a technical identifier. They weren't in the program's operational language or its formal designation system or its coded terms for things that didn't have public names. They were the fragment of something larger, a sentence pulled from a context she couldn't see, and the context would determine whether they were remarkable or meaningless, and she didn't have the context. Before the signal, the ICD had a signal. The human transmission that had come back changed, arrived 11 years ago, carrying a date roughly 5 years from now. Before that signal, the program had been running for over 60 years. Before the signal, the ICD had been expanding through the solar system on the technology recovered from the crash sites. Before the signal, there had been the program and everything it had built and everything it had learned and everything it had classified and everything it had made disappear. Before the signal, there was a voice, and it knew our name. She didn't know what it meant. She didn't have a framework for it. The ICD had a specific way of thinking about what had happened in 1947 and what had been recovered and what had been reverse engineered and what the signal had meant and what the 5 years remaining until the signal's date implied. That framework was operational and technical and deliberately stripped of the kind of register those 14 words carried. A voice, not a signal, not a transmission, a voice that knew our name. She unplugged the chip, set it on the desk. Then she picked it up and put it in the outer pocket of her jacket, on the same side as the photograph. She closed the effects case and signed the return receipt for the morning duty officer. At 11:00 p.m., she called the voice on the secure channel. AB7 investigation is complete. Preliminary report filed at 19:00. Cause of death recorded as equipment malfunction. Seal failure consistent with documented maintenance history. Received. Secondary assessment. Installation systems function within acceptable operational parameters. 40 personnel, standard resource constraints for this tier, no systemic anomalies requiring escalation. Personnel review, no flags requiring action. A pause shorter than the communication delay alone would require. Understood. Your next assignment will be transmitted within 48 hours. Understood. The channel closed. She sat with the communicator on the desk, and the effects case beside it, and the chip in her jacket, and the photograph in her jacket. She thought about Petra Malone in Section 7C on the night of the 17th. The specific configuration of that space. The outer seal at the far end, the equipment storage along both walls, the low ceiling, the single overhead light strip, the corridor width that was barely enough for a person and a trolley side by side. The emergency bulkhead had triggered on its automatic pressure differential sensor at 11:24 p.m., 1 minute after the event record. The responding crew had arrived at 11:27 p.m., remains consistent with catastrophic decompression. She had encountered it before. She understood what the record's careful language described, and didn't require description to know what Malone had experienced in those final seconds in a sealed corridor with a failed outer seal. Malone had spent 6 months hiding transmissions that contained nothing. She had been careful and skilled and certain she was doing something. Whatever she had believed she was building, the ICD had been inside it for 6 of those 8 months, reading everything, emptying the packets, forwarding the shells. It died transmitting nothing. She had never known. Renn turned off the light and lay down. In the morning, she completed the close-out paperwork. She noted Akafer's cooperation. She rated the installation's records management as adequate and the emergency response protocols as compliant. No systemic concerns were noted. She filed the second death in the standard casualty report structure. Darrow Finch, systems technician, 7 years at AB7. Cardiac event, 2:47 a.m., confirmed by the medical officer. The structure existed because these kinds of outcomes had always needed a structure. Both deaths resolved. Equipment malfunction. Natural causes, both accidental. She marked the investigation closed. She packed her bag. The jacket went on and she checked the inside pocket. The photograph was there. She pressed her fingers against the outer pocket and felt the chip case. Both were where she'd left them. The transfer vehicle would dock at 4:00 p.m. She spent 3 hours finishing documentation in the Section B2 briefing room, writing in the careful neutral language the program required, the language that described outcomes without describing what produced them. The 4th hour she spent in her quarters with the terminal dark and the air at its consistent 18 degrees and the structural vibration in the floor. She thought about the fragment. No context for it existed that she had. No way to know whether Malone had written it, or received it, or found it in something that no longer existed beyond this fragment. The chip might have been the thing she was trying to send. The chip might have been something she'd kept in her personal effects, because it mattered to her for reasons Renn couldn't see. Malone was dead and her transmissions had contained nothing for 6 months, and her data was largely unrecoverable except for those 14 words, and those 14 words were a fragment from a context she didn't have. Before the signal, there was a voice and it knew our name. She thought about what she did have. The gradient file from the moon's far side in her encrypted archive, stable anomaly, continuous, filed and not reported. Ibarra's list of 47 names, every one of them recognized, filed and not reported. The watcher in Chicago, patient and skilled, whose surveillance methods had been slightly wrong for any human intelligence service she knew, observed and not pursued and not reported. But the anomalies were real. Each one on its own was real. The gradient file was real. The list was real. The watcher was real. And these 14 words were real, found in the corrupted data chip of a dead woman who had spent 6 months transmitting nothing and never known it, who had been 31 years old in a sealed corridor on a rock in the asteroid belt, and had died not knowing that the last 6 months of what she'd built had been emptied before it went anywhere. Whatever Malone had known or believed or been trying to say, whatever had been in those packets before the relay node at Echo 7 opened them and replaced the content with null data and sent the shells through. The ICD had that. Whatever it was, the ICD had read it and made a decision about it, and Malone had died, and the packets had kept going out on schedule, and none of it was accessible to Renn. Except the fragment. Except these 14 words. She pressed her hand briefly against the outer pocket of her jacket, feeling the chip case. Then she took her hand away. The transfer vehicle docked at 4:01 p.m. She heard it in the port arms vibration, the familiar flex of the installation accepting a new pressure engagement. She picked up her bag and walked out of Section D and down Corridor A2 and through the junction and down A1 to the airlock, past the B1 junction and the B2 briefing room where she had spent 3 days listening to people carefully describe a world in which Petra Malone had died because a seal failed. Past C2. Past the junction that led down to the outer tunnel sections and the emergency bulkhead on B3, sealed and logged, the corridor beyond it inaccessible and dark. She didn't look back at the corridor behind her. The magnetic boots clocked on the grating in their soft, regular rhythm, the sound that had preceded her since she arrived and would keep preceding her in her hearing for days after she left. She had her own catalog of sounds from places she had been and closed and left. This one would join the catalog the way they all did, gradually, reluctantly, with a persistence she had learned not to fight. The airlock cycled. She stepped through. The transfer vehicle was cold relative to AB7. Its air was cleaner in the way you believe when you've been somewhere worse for long enough. She found her seat. She strapped in. The port arm disengaged and the vehicle rotated slowly, orienting for departure, and she felt the change in the vibration under her feet as the connection to AB7 released, and the vehicle became its own sealed environment again, separate from the asteroid, moving in its own orbit. Through the flight deck window, she could see the asteroid's surface for 3 seconds before the vehicle's attitude shifted and it was gone. Gray rock, irregular, pocked and dark, surface features moving almost imperceptibly in the slow rotation. The light from the distant sun falling at a low angle so the shadows were long and sharp. About 2-3 kilometers in its long dimension. 40 people inside it. 2 new bodies and the rest of the crew going about the business of the day. It looked from this distance and this angle like any other piece of rock in the inner belt, indistinguishable from the hundreds of thousands of objects in this region that contained nothing anyone had put inside them and had never had anything put inside them and were simply moving in their orbits in the dark. The vehicle's attitude shifted and it was gone. Renn reached into her outer jacket pocket and touched the chip case, pressed it once, removed her hand. 48 hours until the next assignment. 6 days minimum to the nearest relay. The photograph on the left side, the chip on the right, the gradient file in her encrypted archive, the list in her memory, the watcher in Chicago unresolved and not forgotten. She was moving through the space between AB7 and wherever she was going next, carrying what she was carrying, knowing what she knew and what she didn't know, and understanding that the difference between those two things was what she had always been working with. Before the signal, there was a voice. The flight deck window showed empty space. The asteroid was behind her somewhere in the dark and she couldn't see it anymore. The structural vibration of the rock was gone. The metallic undertone of the air gone. The magnetic boot sound on the grating gone. Would be gone for 6 days. Would come back when she arrived somewhere with metal grating floors and recycled air and a sealed space with people in it going about the business of the program. She looked at the window. She waited.